Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Barbarian and this is Victoria 3's National Market, both community but also dev response discussion. I would like to take a look at that. Now I will inform you that yesterday I got my second COVID shot and I'm feeling great, but also I have some of the side effects. I'm sweating a bit, but I can't stop thinking about national markets, and so I said, you know, I got that vaccinated attitude. I would like to do this video despite not feeling entirely perfect, and if there's anything that doesn't make sense, then do point it out in the comments. If you disagree with any of my positions that I take in this video, please do make your case as well. All of that is always incredibly interesting to read, and I think with that we should just start into the very first comment. If I understand your point on rebellions, it is that you as a player in 2021 should have control over more aspects and there should be ways for you to manage the situation. Whilst I agree with this to an extent, I do feel that games like this do still benefit from a degree of randomness, as it gives you something to manage around. Is it gamey? Arguably yes, but arguably a lot of flashpoints and sparks in history have been the result of small random events, chance meetings of protagonists, or circumstances coming together. I just hope they don't make it easy to avoid uprisings and rebellions and make everything hunky-dory when it was an age defined by civil war, uprisings, rebellions, and fervor for independence. That particular paragraph I do want to point out we don't disagree on at all. One of my frustrations with CK3 is the amount of transparency so many choices and decisions have. I know the outcome and the exact percentage reaction instead of trying to influence something in vain. Sorry, I'm just rambling here, time to press play again. So, here's the way I feel about this. I think it was a bit of a bad communication on my part, basically, you know, that I said, hey, I would like to have more stuff going on there, but what I meant, just to explain that a bit further, is basically that I want more interaction. Let's take CK3 as an example for how I don't want to see it when it comes to factions, for example, when it comes to rebels and so on and so forth. In CK3 you get a faction, that faction is unhappy, of course, you know, they joined because they were unhappy, and your way to get out of it is either by defeating them if they, or when they rebel, or to, you know, talk to everybody individually and, you know, converse with them and say, okay, here's some money, here's some, I don't know what, some land, some vassal, etc, etc, and now please leave that faction. And that is a really primitive behavior, really primitive interaction. In EU4, for example, we have, hey, there are rebels in your country. What do? Do you suppress them? Do you wait? Do you basically do nothing? Because, you know, the only alternative is to convert, for example, these territories into cores, or convert the population to your culture and or religion, and that is primitive. What I want from Victoria 3 is not actually something related to I want more control, I want more interaction. In CK2+, and in HIP, so the Historical Immersion Project, I believe that is the name, for CK2, what you could do is you could go and basically talk to the factions at their meetings and say, hey, you know what, we can all come to compromise, we can all do these things, etc, etc. It is more of a different approach that is offered there, rather than just, okay, there's a faction, I either defeat them or I just bribe them individually, you know, just the more important lords. I think there is something there that is more interesting, that could be done. And especially in Victoria 3, when we take a look at how factions are organized, basically, where you have an actual leader, you know, hey, if I compromise that leader, if I got something on them, or if I give something that they really care about, even if the faction doesn't, because leaders, of course, also have their own ideologies, that has been confirmed so far, I think that should have more interactive potential than just saying, hey, Victoria 3, you got, you know, a faction, basically, and you can either suppress them, or you can, you know, fully engage them and say, okay, I agree with everything you want. For example, in CK3 it would mean getting off your throne, but in Victoria 3 it could mean social reform, for example. Why can't I talk to them? Why can't I say, okay, hey, I would like to go and maybe have a conversation about what compromise we can reach? This sort of thing is something that really falls flat, even in Stellaris. Stellaris comes the closest when it comes to that, because Stellaris gives you several points, right? If you've ever played Stellaris, then you will get political factions at some point, and these factions will basically say, we like X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Those are the things we like, and if you fulfill some of them, we might be happy. If you fulfill none of them, we will be very unhappy. Now that is something that we already see fulfilled by the interest groups in Victoria 3, but I really just want to point out, I want more of that. I think that's basically where I come from. I would like to see that implemented for normal rebel factions, for example, as well. Yeah, basically, that's my point. I think when I said in 2021, what I mean is, I think we should graduate from a direct relationship between, hey, I suppress you or I kill you, or, you know, I just do exactly what you want. I think we should graduate from that and see more shades of grey, 50 shades maybe, and basically say, okay, we have this interaction that we can do, but we could also just talk to them and do a bit of a tug of war between their interests and our interests. Yeah, basically, I'm primarily asking for more interactive complexity. I do completely agree that this is the era of rebellion, the era of revolution and failed revolutions. I mean, thinking of Germany in 1848, 1849, you know. But yeah, I hope that you get where I'm coming from. I don't really think we disagree. I do get the frustration with CK3, and that's where I am actually also coming from when it comes to I want more complexity that I can interact with. Let's move on to the next one. Regarding state independence, with the USA being one of the main protagonists of the game, surely there needs to be a way for states to have a degree of autonomy. Having a nationwide healthcare plan for the entire US is somehow still a point of contention. It's not just the US either. Individual state autonomy and increasing throughout the time period should be a key political trade-off in my opinion. That's actually really interesting. Honestly, I didn't think about the fact that in certain organizations, and I'm talking about state organizations, so how a country organizes itself. You know, when you look at Germany, you got the federal entity, you got the state entity, and you got the communal entity, very reminiscent of, for example, the US, which is of course also a federal country, but at the same time, in Germany it is a bit different because the top-down level still interacts much more from the top to the down level compared to the US, where there is a lot more autonomy going on. The fact that institutions go and say, this institution is true for every incorporated state in this nation, I think it works as a gameplay system. I think that is acceptable, but I do actually agree. It's a really interesting point that, of course, that's not actually true depending on your genuine state organization. You know, the republic that we have in France, that is a presidential republic, is completely different from the parliamentary republic that we have in Germany today. So yeah, interesting point. I don't think it's going to be in the game. I will also say I don't think that it is, a massive point where I think this needs to be in, but I actually agree. I fundamentally do think that this is an interesting concept that may be implemented later on because it would give you more depth to state building, to nation building, and so on. Let's move on. Alright, here we have an interesting one, especially the second part. The thing with the telecom's postal institution is that it was an actual issue during the time period. America had rapidly developing private telegraphs and like the telephone monopolies, but an incredibly robust public post system. Nationalizing things like posts and telecoms was a huge thing in the time period, and I'd like to see an institution for them, sort of like the healthcare system. Also, something I'd like to see for capitalist countries that's probably not making it into the game: companies. Organizations of capitalists, landowners, industrialists, etc., not like political parties or interest group, they can have entirely separate interests politically, they collectively own and profit from things that they own. What they would be able to own would depend on your institutions and laws. If, for example, if you had a private healthcare system, they could own a portion of the institution. They might be able to participate in other companies as though they were a pop. Maybe they could even own states in some cases, a la East India Company. They could then use this economic rather than political influence to exert their will and fill their collective interests. If there's a paper monopoly, maybe if you don't comply with their demands, they prefer to sell internationally than to you, resulting in a domestic paper shortage, even if the actual paper supply is good, I assume. Maybe if there's a chair duopoly, they can just effectively participate in price fixing or a price war, modifying the national prices of chairs. You could have a law or two centered around them, for example, allowing international companies, allowing just market companies, or even domestic companies only, and this could play into the political versus economic divide that you talked about when it comes to markets versus spheres. We will get to markets versus spheres later on. There was actually confirmation on that topic, which I'm very excited about, just for the record. But so first of all, telecoms or postal institution sounds interesting. I'm not against it at all. Second of all, I've also talked about this privately with friends. When it comes to the topic of companies. This is actually something that it's insanely interesting, and I don't think we're going to see it represented at all. Maybe we will see it later, but especially in the history of the US, for example, it was very, very important when it comes to, the Antitrust Act, for example, when it comes to the engagement against people like Rockefeller and his empire, basically, that he built. I would really like to see a negative influence from your own market onto your own market, because a company is monopolizing something that you didn't want monopolized, for example. It would, I believe that it would make market economies much more interesting to play in. Right now, if you think about it, you have a market economy, and every industrial part, so every factory, is basically working on their own. They're just saying, yep, this is fair capitalism. We're here, we're doing our stuff, and we're just building chairs. That's all we do. But in reality, obviously, these people want more power, they want more influence, they want more money, and that is made by crushing the rest of the opposition. So, for example, buying up other chair industrial plants. If you have a location, for example, where a chair plant would be... Oh, chair plant is completely the wrong word. A chair factory would go bankrupt. Maybe the other company swoops in, buys them up, and then says, please do build some infrastructure here so that we can run it. That is something that oftentimes happens, and I do think that it would also make it so that maybe the chair industry, the chair factories that we currently have in a location, could be run by different competitors that have different financial treasuries. For example, you see it these days. Let me explain it in a very modern example. what you see very often is that you have these mom and pop stores, right? They're like, hey, we got like, I don't know, a hardware store, for example. We sell hardware, etc., etc. We can call in other pieces as well. It takes a while and it's more expensive, but we can bring it in. And then you have other people like in Germany, MediaMarkt and Saturn, which, by the way, belong to the same company. MediaMarkt and Saturn are the same company. They just act like they're competition. But basically, my idea here is that what these companies, these bigger companies do, they come in, they completely level your price system, because they basically come in and say, we can offer all of this stuff for cheaper because we have such a big treasury in the back. Then the mom and pop stores go bankrupt and you say, hey, I can raise the prices now. If we had this system in Victoria 3, I think it would be very interesting. I don't think that this is in the scope of the base game, but I most certainly think if they do the classic model of long-term support, this should be inside of it. This is a massive idea. To basically say that your own market can ruin itself, which it can. It absolutely can. And you as the state may have to interact with it because, right now, all of a sudden, oil is completely monopolized, for example. Really interesting point. I think it's really, really good. Let me know what sort of ideas you have about this, but I do feel that this is outside of the scope of the base game. We need a functioning economy first and foremost. But after that, I would absolutely love to see more focus on the topic of actual companies and, how they interact within the market. Now, is that maybe a bit too complex? Maybe. Is it still interesting? Oh yeah, big time. Market unions seem like a great way to help smaller nations, but will it bring much benefit to larger nations? Is it going to be worth it for a large nation to get other nations into its union, or would it be better for, let's say, Prussia to just conquer the small German nations? It is an interesting concept and will be a very cool feature if implemented properly. So, I have basically a million questions about the separation of markets and spheres. First of all, I think it's the right step. I think it is entirely correct. But second of all, there are some other topics. Let's say you have, as Prussia, you have Braunschweig in your market and you have, I don't know, Baden in your market. Now these two go to war. What happens? What if somebody is, for example, also a nation that is completely surrounded by a different nation within the same market, and that nation declares on that surrounded nation declares war? Do they still get access to Berlin, so to the market capital? There's many questions that I have here, but basically, when it comes to the reference of this comment, I basically have no answers, and am also wondering a lot of things. I do assume that having somebody in your market already gives you a topic, some base influence, because having your economies tied together, which is exactly what happens when you have a common market, makes it so that people rely on one another. They can specialize. For example, Baden could start building only artillery, and Prussia could only start building, I don't know, rifles, for example. Those are one of those things. I think this is an interesting topic, and I really like the idea that you could still have wars within a market. Now, how that exactly would look, honestly, I don't know. But yeah, no. Basically, on this topic, on this comment, no answers from me. I honestly, we don't know enough about the diplomatic game, about the way wars work, to really say anything meaningful here. I do suspect that at the very least, if you are Prussia and you put all of the small nations into your markets, which they are in 1836, I have to assume that this gives you like a baseline of political influence, because basically the idea that your market is connected to them already ties you together. That's definitely something that happens here. And let's say 1866 comes along, the German war, the Bruderkrieg begins. All of a sudden, of course, Saxony in particular, Saxony is always the most famous example because they were so tied into the Prussian market, but they were allied to the Austrians, and that market would collapse. From today to tomorrow, they would have a difficult time supplying all of their factories because most of their goods genuinely came from Prussia. I think that is interesting. I think that is a good thing. I could, add somebody to my market and then make it so that they basically know if they wanted to be added, they wouldn't be able to really go against me despite not directly being in my political sphere. Interesting idea. How it exactly plays out, no clue whatsoever. What do you think about the idea of Victoria 3 having mission trees, similar to EU4 and Imperator Rome, with both historical and ahistorical paths, some missions for conquering regions, developing your economy, spreading your influence? I think that's a bad idea. So I get where you're coming from, and I don't actually think that this is fundamentally a bad thing. When it comes to Imperator Rome, I think a lot of guidance is needed, unless you really hard tune the AI to go into X places and Y places. The mission trees there basically exist to create a realistic circumstance, but that is not at all what I would want from Victoria 3. Victoria 3 needs emerging gameplay. People, for example, talked about this when it comes to the revolution 1848, 1849. It basically swept from France to the rest of Europe. Hungary was hit very early on as well with the revolutionary sentiment. Then we had Poland, we had Germany, we had Italy to a certain degree, for example. And all of that, you can, see, Victoria 2 actually suffered a lot from this. Victoria 2, to actually understand that things are happening and that they will be happening, you needed to know history. There would be events that just said, hey, hey, here's more consciousness, here's more militancy for your pops, for example. It wasn't 100% railroaded, but you basically needed to know where the train wanted to go to actually succeed in that game. You needed to know how Prussia unified Germany to unify Germany as Prussia. It was vital to understand what the dynamics were. I don't want that, and this would be including missions basically, at all in Victoria 3. If there's a revolution in France, for example, it might spark revolutionary sentiments in the rest of the countries by, I don't know, +3 militancy, but there should be a way to say, hey, but I made my pops happy. They're not going to rebel against me. If pops are already radicalized, maybe they start a rebellion, and that is how you get 1848, 1849, but no, I do not want any mission trees. I would like the game to be able to show us the rough circumstances of this century that we will be covering from 1836 to 1936. I would like the game to be able to do that by emerging dynamic gameplay. That is really what it's all about. They already talked about this as well, so I'm not worried about this at all. First of all, I get the sentiment from you as a commenter, from you as a player, but I personally don't want that at all. They also confirmed already that the American Civil War doesn't have to happen. It doesn't have to happen the way it did. It really depends on the consciousness and the militancy of your pops. So yeah, basically they share my opinion. Again, I get your opinion, but I don't think it's a good match for Victoria 3 in any way. Alright, here we got a next comment. I'm not entirely certain about this one. Please do leave a comment if you're this commenter and let me know about exactly what you meant. But, so, does this mean that I get to help Iran civilize as Prussia to get access to Indian rare goods markets? So first of all, yesn't. What it means is you can definitely do that, and you could theoretically sign a trade agreement with them, but you still need to get the goods from A to B. So what you need to do is, for example, you need to land in, southern Iran and then bring it all the way either around the African Cape or around the Suez Canal if it's already built into Germany. That's a long way. That's a long path that you would have to, administrate, but it is possible. Yeah, you could definitely either vassalize them, which would then add them to your market, or you could just sign a trade agreement, making it so that they are within your market, but yeah, you still sort of need to move it, because within a market, this is what we know from the infrastructure dev diary, you still have to adhere to the idea of transportation. In this case, likely with, a port, because there is no direct railroad connection unless, for some reason, the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire are also within your market. But yeah, you know where I'm coming from, I hope. Is it possible to buy Indian goods from London? It probably will be. The question is just how exactly that looks like, what exactly that looks like. We know that market internally, you also already need ports that actually transport goods from A to B, so from India to London, and then you surely can buy those goods from the British market via trade routes into the German market. I want to break India up so that the British don't have a monopoly over those goods. That is definitely a political move. Everyone who declares war on the British risks being cut off from these goods, and therefore make your capitalists unhappy. Yeah, that is true. I mean, that is a big part, though. You shouldn't want to get rid of this fundamentally, because this is a big part of the concert of Europe and why the British were so interested in having a balance in Europe, so that nobody actually rises up against them, because it would be bad for their trade, but also bad for the European trade. Maybe the British have a way to influence the world without applying direct power, just threaten with an embargo and make others dance to a tune. So what we know is that the crises system that they had in Victoria 2, where you would basically say, hey, I'm a big power, I'm a great power, and I'm saying this small nation should have this piece of land, and the other great power will say, no, this should remain with me or with one of my allies, for example. And then you have a bit of a crisis going on there. They can come to a diplomatic conclusion, they can go to war, all of that stuff. That apparently will be a fundamental part of warfare and diplomacy until you have warfare in Victoria 3 to begin with. So yeah, this will definitely be a thing where you can, as Britain, say, hey, you know what, if you really want to go against me, you can, but we are on different sides here, and I hope that you understand what that means, and you better back off. That is basically where it comes from. Yeah, just wanted to address this, because I do think understanding markets is very important for this game, so just talking about it makes a lot of sense. Let's move on. Alright, now here we move into an interesting topic. This is the loss of stockpiles. As for the dev diary, I'm not entirely sure about how to feel about losing a stockpile. Yes, I grant you that the stockpile in Victoria 2 never really worked in the way it was intended to, but I do worry that this new system without some sort of stockpiles will allow for those stupid rage-inducing moments, where you're at war but your factories are trading away all your bullets or tanks because they're not actively being used up right away, even though you are planning a major offensive. I sincerely hope that there is some way for at least military goods to be stockpiled in the same vein. We all know that in the original Victoria 2, the UK is the only producer of machine parts in the beginning of the game. If you were to be at war for a few years with the UK in this current system, I'm going to guess that you are not allowed access to the UK market, therefore completely shutting off your supply of machine parts for everything in your country. With a stockpile, you could at least have some leeway before you completely run out of that good, as it would be in real life. So, let's talk about stockpiles. In Victoria 2, you can consciously stockpile a certain good in a certain amount. And it is an interesting idea, right? It's a very interesting concept. And as this comment establishes, and you don't need to agree with it, you don't need to agree with me, but let's just assume that we can agree that it didn't work in Victoria 2. Why am I personally okay with no stockpiles? So there are no good stockpiles that you can configure. But realistically speaking, there are stockpiles on 2 levels. So that just from a gameplay point of view, okay? There's a stockpile where we have the money stockpile of a company. So that is a stockpile to a certain degree because they will be able to keep producing even if they need to pay more. And, man, this will actually be like an hour-long discussion basically, but to try and keep it quick here. If you lose access to a good, we saw that with dyes, you could change your production method, or you will be producing less over time. So even if you immediately lose access to dyes entirely, you will just like get downgraded basically until you reach a shortage, in which case it will be more severe, and then you know that shortage can be more severe again. But basically, I would describe this as stockpiling that is automatic. If you think about it, the assumption that even after you're cut off, you can still go and yeah, you keep producing, it gets less and less efficient, but you keep producing, that's basically stockpiling. There's basically an imagined stockpile, if you will, an automatic stockpile, that makes it so that your market doesn't collapse immediately if you get cut off of something. In Victoria 2, that wasn't the case. Since it was a closed economy, it was a very hard market. If you don't have access to good A, you will immediately basically flounder. You will flounder. You will just be gone, right? In Victoria 3, it sounds as though that is different. Basically, you have a smooth transition towards not having access, which starts by, okay, yeah, we got a theoretical stockpile that basically lets us produce, and then it's lower availability, so we get lower effectiveness of our production method here, until we reach the shortage. So let's say, and this is right out of my buttocks, so I don't actually know that these are the numbers, this is made up, but let's say it takes 12 months to go from normal access to shortage. And in between we become less and less efficient, but we can still produce this. I don't think that's unrealistic. I think that's fine. I don't personally think, even for military goods, we need a manual stockpile. I need the system to work, obviously. I need the idea of this automatic stockpile that I just described to actually work in-game as well. I'm not sure whether it works. I haven't played the game. I wish I had. But yeah, that's where I'm coming from. I see the idea of this. But since we don't have a hard market, since even if the market directly disconnects, our people can still say, alright, it just costs more and more every week, basically, to buy these goods, that is simulating the shortage. It is sourcing from our own market, and these goods don't exist until we buy them. I want to stress that as well. Is it entirely realistic? Certainly not, but it is an adequate representation of what occurs. You would have to have a higher price every week as you go higher. Until you reach the shortage, when, of course, production actually becomes basically impossible. So I think I get the point, and I get the idea of really wanting to prepare for a war with this. But if you have a factory that is rich, that has a big treasury, that can operate even under losses, that is in a position where you had access to this good until just now, you will still have that factory run, even if it is on lower effectiveness as you go through the weeks, you will still have that factory run, right? And that is basically a stockpile. So I personally do not think we need manual stockpiles for military goods either. I do think that you will feel the effect of a market closing itself off because you are at war, but it is spread out over time rather than immediate. And I will tell you right now that in Victoria 2, if you prepare for a stockpile, first of all, obviously you're manipulating the world market price like crazy, which is just insane, but that's a world market issue of Victoria 2. Let's not even worry about that. But the idea of it is, to me, that you basically... And in Victoria 2, it was just tremendously terrible how both the budget would stack so much money on top of itself, but also the stockpiles could stack so much of this good on top of itself, which made zero sense. I think basically the game assumes the more factories you have, the more will you be able to have realistic stockpiles that aren't really, that are just in the background, that don't really exist in the game mechanics, but are emptying themselves as you are within the embargo or within the war and go down there until you reach the shortage. Yeah, that's basically my point. I think we have a less realistic, less hard way of having a stockpile, but when it comes to the functionality, from the way it looks to me, as I hear about this game and as I hear, you know, the dev answers that we're going to get to, the dev responses, I personally feel as though this system actually will work significantly better than a hard stockpile. I don't think we're going to encourage or encounter the situation where the UK, you know, you're at war with the UK, you immediately run out of everything. Rather, your stockpile starts depleting and until the shortage sets in. So I think it should be fine, but whether it actually works, we'll see in the game. Difficult to ascertain. I don't think that this is actually no stockpiles, it's just no manual stockpiles, basically. When the dev diary mentions stockpiles and their removal, I remember that old Bocone 1's Wiki 2 game where the player ran out of iron, which is like 1/3 of the Earth's crust, so what the hell? Because one of the players was abusing the stockpile system. He was going back and forth on the stockpile slider, buying up all of the iron and then reducing the size of the stockpile to 0, which kept slowly deleting the world's iron supply. So yeah, I won't miss the stockpiles. See, we can always say, well, you know, but we can do it better, right? But fundamentally, I think that a manual system like that is basically just ripe for abuse. And I don't think that that is the idea of the stockpile. The idea of the stockpile is that you can produce as you are cut off of something, and that is already given with the automatic idea that the shortage sets in over after a certain amount of time in Victoria 3. So yeah, Bacone, by the way, yeah, great Victoria content if you're interested in it. I would definitely recommend it. Now with this one, I'm going to skip the top part. We're going to only focus on the red part. If I had to guess why private healthcare still requires bureaucracy with higher levels requiring more, might be that what the bureaucrats are doing is making sure all the licenses and whatnot are in order, with higher levels meaning that there's more oversight, more types of licenses and laws that apply, like how in Germany the person prescribing medication, the physician, is not allowed to also be the one providing, selling it, the apothecary. Or one proper man can probably explain it better than me, and so on. I will tell you, I don't like apothecaries. They really do like to sell you a bunch of garbage. Like, listen, we have like one apothecary at every street corner and half of them really want to rip you off. But let's skip over that, okay? Hypothetically, at level 1, to be able to call yourself a doctor, you just need to purchase from the government a license to practice medicine. It lets you do whatever kind of medicine you like, and there's little to no oversight. While at level 5, there are licenses for each specialization. There are strict rules on what is and is not allowed, but both under each license in general, and inspectors making sure everything is as they should be as a regular thing. On buildings versus institutions, I fully agree with you and the devs. Having to go through everywhere and tell them to build schools and hospitals would be a massive chore, not dissimilar to how it can feel at times in Year 4. However, I would say that it might still make sense for big important buildings to be something you can order to be built. Universities, cathedrals, royal infirmaries, etc. So, with the first one, I actually thought that was a good point. I didn't see it from that angle, but yeah, sure, there is still administration, whether the private healthcare system would have as much administration, though, as the public healthcare system. I highly doubt that, but I think this is a good point. This certainly raises the idea that, of course, there are still state authorities behind this. State authorities are still involved in this, so you should still pay, you know, administration for, or bureaucracy for the entire thing. Now, buildings versus institutions, yeah. The micro isn't great. I do think more buildings could be neat, but the buildings that we've seen so far, honestly, there is way more of them than in Victoria 2, and I would be very interested in actually seeing that in action. I assume, since we have the investment pool even in free market economies, making it so that capitalists no longer build on their own, but rather you build for them, there will already be a lot more micro in building things, because you will be building the factories. You will be going and saying, I want to upgrade this level, I want to have this right here, right there. In Victoria 2, that wasn't the case. They just built whatever they wanted, most of the time poorly, but they just built whatever they wanted. You didn't have to worry about it. You had to worry about, oh my god, let's build all of the fort levels and let's build all of the train levels. It was, god, hideous, terrible. Now, you will still have to do that, but in a different way and on a different scope. So I think this is, honestly, yeah, I think the way they have institutions right now sounds definitely fine to me at the very least. I think the anomalies in Hanover, Nizza and Gibraltar, with the different markets they are in, is because of the treaty port thing they mentioned. Like, they said you can even get a province in someone else's market to influence it, like Hong Kong or something. And they said Britain has one province in the French market to do so. So what if they also have Gibraltar in the Spanish market, and Hanover in the Prussian market, and SP in the French market in a similar way? So, what we know is that states are fundamentally always in the same market, unless there's a treaty port. And this actually makes me sad. Because while states can be split freely, gameplay-wise, they won't be split except for treaty ports. Hannover very clearly has control of its boundaries, of, you know, its territories, but since it is one state, it isn't split, unless it were a treaty port, which it isn't. Yeah, I will say, it is what it is. I think it's a minor impact there, but I can't say I'm all too happy with it. No, like, it is so inflexible after after like 10 years since Victoria 2 to basically say only treaty ports can actually split states. I can't say I'm a fan. I'm not a fan, no. We will see what actual influence it will have that Nizza has, or, you know, Nice has an impact on the French economy, despite being in Italy, and how Sardinia-Piedmont actually deals with it, how Hanover deals with it, how the French islands in the Indian market, being in the British market, deal with it. Yeah, I'm not sure. We'll actually see how that goes. There's a big topic here when it comes to trade deals, because you technically don't need trade deals. If you just bring goods into that province, then you can access the British market, even from Prussia, without having a trade deal with the British market. But whether that is true, how that actually works, we shall see. It's difficult to say. That is, I can't really talk about that. I honestly don't know the circumstances. I just don't like it from the basic concept of how inflexible it is, basically. Alright, now here we have a long one. I have a burning question that came up with a stockpile point. You mentioned it. I would be very happy to hear what you think. Victoria 2's budgeting is notoriously inefficient. The UKAI tends to hoard 100 million and above by 1900, which is more than enough to fund the state completely for the rest of the game. On the other hand, small nations are finding it impossible to balance their books. In general, the budget debt system is completely broken. The way bankruptcy and debt works make it so that all players and AI has an incentive to hoard massive budget surpluses, taxing way beyond what is necessary to fund the government to put into vaults never to be spent. I would love a reworked budget system. That was an integral part of financing 19th century economies. For example, late Imperial Russia's industrialization was almost completely dependent on French loans. The US also industrialized and developed on the back of European loans. The US was a debtor nation until World War I. A far better system, in my opinion, would be a more balanced approach to budgets, a sort of Laffer curve, if you will. Higher taxes reduce the ability of pops to buy goods, which reduces demands and suffocates growth. Low taxes allow more demand and increase standard of living, which increases production. Basically, lower percentage shares of higher incomes or higher percentage shares of lower incomes. This would be great because it would mean that the UKAI, for example, will no longer have an incentive to hoard endless cash, because that would negatively affect their industry and reduce the amount they can hoard. It would also mean there is legitimate interest in reducing taxes if your government can fund all of its operations and still run big budget surplus, something Victoria 2 didn't really have. Beyond being just intuitive, I think this would fix the broken finance system of Victoria 2, which leads to abhorrent hoarding, liquidity crises, and economic collapses in the endgame. I don't have an issue with economic downturns being present in the game, but damn, the UK should not be running budget surpluses constantly when they have 30 years of spending saved up in a vault. I fundamentally agree. I think that the finances of Victoria 2 obviously were completely wacky, completely nonsensical, but I will also mention that this isn't necessarily just because of the way financing worked in CK2, but it is also about the fact that the world market allowed you to buy things at a certain rate that otherwise wouldn't be possible. In Victoria 2, you know, hey, if you weren't producing a good in your own market whatsoever, your pops could still be buying it on the world market, albeit for a greater cost. In Victoria 3, that is fundamentally different. In Victoria 2, you couldn't really feel the impact of your taxes suffocating them unless they really weren't even able to get it on the world market. In Victoria 3, you just won't have access to something. I think we might see in Victoria 3 a level where having taxes high can be good in certain situations and bad in others. Now, of course, it was also true in Victoria 2, but again, it didn't really follow a sensible pattern because of the way markets worked and the way pop consumption worked to begin with. But I would be interested in seeing something, yeah, no, absolutely, where the UK in a certain situation says we don't actually want high taxes and we will bring them down. We don't need the surplus right now. We can have that in private consumption. Whereas, you know, in other circumstances, they might go, yeah, we definitely need high taxes right now. I mean, you know, hey, it is also why the American Revolution happened to a certain degree. But I hope you know where I'm coming from. I think it's a good point, in particular with how bad Victoria 2 worked on this level. How it actually works out, I mean, we don't really know that much about the interplay there. It is also definitely something that we will have to see. It will be day-to-day balancing. Victoria 3 at the end of the day is also something that, you know, hey, whether the systems will actually work, how they will work, we will only see actually in action. But I think the base idea here, where high taxes, or rather a high budget and a high budget surplus, don't have to be good. I think that is a great idea. Now, again, in a certain way, it already could work like this in Victoria 2, but the way consumption and markets worked was nonsensical, and made it all bad. Yeah, good comment. I actually genuinely agree. I think I hope that it certainly goes into this direction. I fully agree that an ambitious system that is broken is just flat out worse than in simpler systems that works. I think too many people have this romanticization of a perfect simulation and really want the game to be more realistic and follow real economic models as closely as you can. But a perfect simulation is impossible, so if you try to do that without taking this basic fact into account, we'll only end up with a broken simulation. While if you do consider what is possible or not for the game and work around that, you can create a system that arrives at more realistic outcomes even without following a strict model. For instance, I see a lot of people complaining about base prices of goods in Victoria 3, as well as the possible min and max prices. They want the game to follow strict supply and demand to calculate prices because that is how the things are in real life, but it isn't really. Or rather, it isn't in a way that you can meaningfully simulate. If you abstract enough, you can arrive at price equals supply versus demand, but the factors that affect both supply and demand are far too numerous for a game to account for. And if you try to use this simple formula without accounting them, you will possibly get wildly more volatile prices than it is actually realistic. Because even if the model to follow is good, if you don't account for everything, the result might not be. So it is better to create a less realistic system that nonetheless arrives to a more realistic situation. I don't know what the F is doing there, but... So, this post addresses, in my opinion at the very least, two things. First of all, the idea that you have a system that works, even if it isn't perfect, even if it isn't the most realistic system. And yeah, as I said before, I personally strongly do not support the idea of buying a game that has fundamentally broken systems. I've done it. I've done it often enough. I've played Paradox games since Hearts of Iron 2. I've played enough broken games. I am a big fan of having working systems that just do what they need to do, even if they don't fully fulfill the idea of what this system would actually be like in real life. Now, the second thing that I think this approaches is the base price topic, which, if you weren't aware, so every good has a base price and then can go up to a certain level in the max price and go down to a certain level in the lowest price. So if you produce a lot of it, it can go down to a very certain depressed price. Now, I think the worries that people have about this are overblown. And what I mean by that is it entirely realistic? Listen, if I am the state and tomorrow I build, I don't know, 50 million apartments everywhere in my country, right? If I did that. A very inflexible trade code, by the way. The price is fairly static because it takes a long time to build something. But where I'm coming from is, if I all of a sudden flood you with supply, obviously the entire market would collapse and nobody would really be willing to pay anything for living because I just gave everyone basically their own apartment. Hey, if we build 83 million in Germany, then everyone has their own apartment. Everybody can live alone for some reason. Now, the thing about this is that the impact, since this isn't realistic, the impact of an oversupply of, for example, living space would be felt long before we reach 83 million built. And at that point, it would have a reaction. It would correct itself. By which I mean, companies that build apartment buildings would start to go bankrupt because the price is already low enough that they can't finance themselves. So let's translate this to Victoria 3 and why I'm not concerned about the base price and the max and min price issue of Victoria 3. Let's talk about shares, which is everybody's favorite topic when it comes to Victoria 3. If I push the base price of chairs down to a minimum level, because I have that many chair manufacturers, we will have a situation where most of them will already go bankrupt, and it will swing back towards the normal price. This effect can be seen in the normal world. You will never have an oversupply so drastic. It's completely unrealistic, except in very, very specific situations, in super specific situations, seriously. But these people will already go bankrupt. And this is what happens realistically as well in real life. Most of the time when it comes to these sort of markets. You have very specific markets where you can actually get to basically this good is valued of, has the value of $0, because it's just so prevalent, it's just so common. Now, I do not think that this is an issue when it comes to like the general economic development, because the impact of the price will be felt by businesses long before it would ever even reach the most depressed or the most, highest price. But I will say that it is true to a certain degree, but I don't think it really is. Let's talk about this. If we have, for example, a phone in 1990, and then compare that to a phone in 2018, that phone all of a sudden has no value. And the other phones that came in as substitution goods all of a sudden have much more value because they do many more things, right? It's a Nokia versus an iPhone versus a modern, I don't know, Google Pixel, whatever. And this substitution, I do feel, can be hampered by the min and max price. But then again, if something already is the min price because it is the better product now all of a sudden, or, you know, it has more appeal, then people will switch to it. We already know this, that there are substitution prices. And I think I'm rambling at this point, which is, I can just say, it's the vaccine side effects, okay? But I hope you understand where I'm coming from, and if not, I will respond to comments, of course, under this video in particular. But basically, the way I see it, I see the argument of the people that don't like the base and the max price and whatnot when it comes to technological advances for goods that substitute themselves in for other goods that are now out, basically, and play no role anymore. I see that, and I don't disagree with that, but I do think we have a substitution system. Whether that actually implements this well is a different topic, but we have a substitution system, and I think that we would just see a natural phase-out. People would no longer be demanding this good, they would like the better good, unless it is too pricey, then they will switch to the other good. And before you even get the max or the minimum price, you will already have people be switching, right? So this is already happening. I think the max and minimum price are basically just there to say, hey, how about you don't break the economic system? That's what I think. Very long rambling, my apologies, let's move on. Something I would personally love to be able to do on this topic is, and I'm not speaking for anyone else here, to be completely clear, this is what I would like to see. For example, have it so that you would have a way of bribing leaders, and you would have a way for your Home Affairs department to reveal secrets. Then, for example, if you have a leader in an interest group who's making them very militant, or bringing different interest groups together, or who's very effective or something, you make a secret backroom deal with him or the group's leadership in an abstract sense to take money in exchange for reducing the group's militancy, maybe with the risk of this failing or backfiring. And then you turn around and use your Home Affairs department to reveal that secret to his group, and suddenly they are catapulted out of leadership, and the interest group's coalition falls apart. Yeah, no, I'm a huge fan. Just for the record. This is more interaction, brings risk. I'm a big fan. Just don't make me just like, you know, hey, I'm suppressing you, I'm encouraging you, I'm killing you on the battlefield because you're rebels. I want more interaction. I think this would be a great form of interaction. In this context, interest groups would be able to form coalitions or factions to push for a specific thing together, obviously. Maybe there could even be the way political parties work. It doesn't have to be this exact thing, and it could be some variations of it, and could incorporate more complexity or whatever. That's not really the point. This was just an example. But basically something that would allow you to find clever and hopefully not too obvious ways to deal with interest groups other than either just giving into them or militarily crushing them in a rebellion. Because I thought in Victoria 2 it could feel a bit simplistic. You usually either make sure they have stuff or give into them or click on the right button in recurring events, or you crush their rebellion. I personally would love for Victoria 3 to have something that feels like a bit of a puzzle to solve. Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I don't... Yeah, good comment. I like the comment. I approve. Could there be a way in national markets for the governments to put price ceilings or price floors on goods depending on the government type? Yes, subsidies are a thing, so you can technically do that for sure. Would it only be partially made up by government subsidies in the event that the price of a good drops too low? No, yeah, for sure. Basically, obviously you have a command economy, you can produce things just by taxes, so that is a command economy going on right there. There is a price floor at that point, depending on how much you support the business. But on the other hand, I mean, you also kind of just get rid of price. That is like a general drawback of command economies in general, but whatever. But yeah, other than that, you can still technically set price targets by saying government subsidies. Whether you can just nail a price as a price target and say this is what you can do. For example, books in Germany work this way, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure books have to be sold at a certain price in Germany. Would be interesting. Whether that works that way, honestly, I don't know. I think it would be an interesting mechanic. Haven't seen anything about it yet, so I have to assume it's not in, but nonetheless, an interesting mechanic. Markets as separate from spheres of influence is a must. To that I would add military alliances, for example. It should be possible, but unlikely for a country to be part of one market in the political sphere of another power and have an alliance of some type with a third power. So what would SOI mean in my take? SOI? Spheres of influence mean in my take. It would mean having clout to interfere in internal politics to, in a way, be an interest group that can put pressure on what reforms to take. Oh my god. Interest groups that are actually foreign interests. I love that idea. I really, really do. I mean, you kind of might even have that. Oh my god, I really love that idea. You could possibly pay off an interest group as an outside faction, and then they shift towards politics that you find more amicable, that you find more interesting from an out. I love that idea. You just blew my mind. And I read that comment before, but now was I like, hey, I understand what's going on here. How much funding to give things and to be able to push them to leaving alliances other than with yourself and to push them to join your market. I don't think that will be part of the vanilla game at release though, but it would make for nice, interesting and complex diplomatic moves going on. I love that. It would be so interesting. I mean, listen. In the 20s and the 30s, and this is a very specific time frame. This is not super common, but of course you had people supporting rebels just in general in foreign countries. But in the 20s and the 30s, Stalin went on and basically vassalized most of the European communist leftist movements. For example, the KPD in Germany was incredibly Stalinized. They were incredibly influenced, and we call it Moskau-hörig, so somebody that listens to Moscow, right? Really interesting angle. I love the idea. Yeah, I totally do. I hope that we get some sort of influence on interest groups in other countries. It could be amazing. Now, regarding no stockpiling, have there be buildings possible to build to stockpile goods in? Every level would hold a set amount of specific good. Different goods would be possible to stockpile differently. Steel lasts longer than fish. Tech would allow improved storage of some goods, fresh fish versus frozen fish, and converting a warehouse from one goods to another would take money and time. Goods that spoil might be modeled using the warehouse consuming some goods every week or month. Or, since the economic model doesn't have stockpiles but does have money, have the warehouses have standing purchase orders if prices drop below X, and sell orders if they rise above Y, and have the warehouse be able to create the goods from the money like a formal factory does, as long as it has the money to do so. So that's basically what they're doing. The second part. I actually like the idea of like physical stockpiles that are very, very limited, because it gets rid of most of the abuse that a player otherwise can do. But just to address this, basically a company can still buy goods, and it just deteriorates every week, at least from how I understand it, if they have the money to do it. They technically have that integrated, basically. Switching goods when the building has plenty of cash lying around so as to create more desired goods from nothing. All money lost when changing it from storing one goods to another. It's interesting. I don't know how much gameplay features would be added by actually having a physical stock by building, for example. But yeah, no, as I said earlier, basically this idea of if you have money you can still buy this good, albeit at a higher price, and later on in the shortage you can't really buy it at all anymore, but that's basically already in. Interestingly enough, it is a way of automatic simulated stockpiling, albeit not as visual or as something that you can influence as in Victoria 2. I think the problem with your idea of splitting economic and political ties is that it could result in a state suddenly being split from its national markets if the two political entities go to war. Yeah, I mean, but that's already an issue, right? What if Bavaria and Prussia in the German market go to war? What happens? What actually happens? What if Bavaria and Baden or Württemberg go to war? Right? So the actual leader of the market isn't involved, but they go to war. What happens? We don't know. We know it's split now. They confirm that these are indeed split, the sphere, so the political level and the economic level. But honestly, we don't know. I'm very interested in warfare. I really am. They haven't said anything yet. Super interested though. About the fixed institutions cost per level, I think one way to solve this is to simply put a modifier. Universal healthcare grants more access to the health system, but costs 100% bureaucracy, for example. Religious schools should cost minus 20 bureaucracy, since it's mostly run by the church, and so on. To be honest, I think this is the kind of balance thing that will change again and again at every patch, so right now don't worry too much about that. Yeah, it's day-to-day politics, no doubt. I completely agree. This is, you need to change that as you go. I do think, I do genuinely still hold the opinion that there should maybe be a bureaucracy trade-off, you know, how much you need to pay for, again, religious schools or schools that you run yourself, so state schools, for example, how the healthcare system works. But if they don't implement that, honestly, I just think it's a balance thing. Realism, I don't think it's that important. It's just a balance thing. It basically just says institution costs more, and that's it. Alright, and these were all the comments for today. We're gonna move on to the dev responses now. Let's just do that before I fall from my chair. Alright, just a second. Alright folks, let's jump into the dev answers. Looks awesome, but the UK is in the French market, as seen in the first screenshot. That can be the start date situation, right? Or it can't be the start date situation. Britain has a little island in the Indian Ocean Territory region, which belongs to the French market. So they actually contribute 0.1% of GDP to the French market at game start. Does that mean that I can impose stuff to that island from, I don't know, London as the UK, and then sell that to the French market without needing a trade deal? Then again, they need to transport it there as well. Honestly, like, I'm really interested in finding out. We talked about this at length when it comes to the responses earlier, but I'm not sure what to think about this. Yeah, obviously this is a side product of states not being split, but I don't know what to think about this. Interesting development of the old spheres of influence on an economic model, but I still have a few questions. Will there be any way to model purely diplomatic informal control of another country? We'll get some more details on various forms of diplomatic control over other countries in a later dev diary. It is correct that shared markets only cover about half of what the spheres of influence entailed. Let's go. We will be able to kick countries out of our national market. Generally speaking, if another country is in your market, it is because you have invited them or hold some sway over them. In this case, you can just kick them out or release them. However, in case a country actually holds a small parcel of land in your market, for example a treaty port, it is not that easy, and you would have to bully them into giving their territory up or take it back by force. And then, can nations with puppets join another country's market, and if so, will the puppets automatically join the new market as well? Yes, puppets join any customs union their overlord accepts an invitation to. Makes sense. Honestly, all of these are fine, again, too, but I've talked about that at length today, so let's skip that. A related question would be, if we have privately owned factory that is selling a good on the market, how do we determine profitability? So if the good was selling for £50 and wages and materials cost 40 to produce, is this satisfactory? I don't know if I'm describing my question correctly. I hope you understand. How did you come up with the base prices? Is there even ever a situation where they can change? Base price setting is more art than science, but generally speaking, luxuries have a higher base price than staples, manufactured goods cost more than resource goods, and high-tech goods cost more than low-tech goods. One thing we struggled with, but found that we think is a very good solution for, is how to signal to the player whether a particular building is good or not, given that everything benefits someone. The solution we settled on is to determine a productivity factor for each building, which is equal to the amount of money each employee generates per year on average, not including wages, dividends, etc., and then compare that productivity factor to other buildings worldwide, both of the same type and across all types, to translate it into a health factor. As a result, you can see at a glance that one building generates 1.9 pounds per employee, while another generates 7.1, and that the first might be good for its type, perhaps a subsistence farm, while the latter could be better for its type. Perhaps it's a steel mill that's falling behind tech-wise, or could be better for its type. Perhaps it's a steel mill that's falling behind tech-wise compared to other steel mills worldwide. Right. This makes a lot of sense. I think this is just a good point. I really just wanted to have that in the video because I do think it makes sense. Pops could theoretically attempt to buy goods that aren't produced or traded to a market. Otherwise, there would be no demand for that good. But in practice, Pops will substitute most of their demand for unavailable goods for locally available ones that can be used to fulfill the same need. Fair enough. Will it be possible to remove yourselves from a market, like for example India removing itself from Britain and becoming its own market? It depends on why you are in the market to begin with. If you are in a customs union, you agreed to your own volition. You can simply leave it. If you're in a market controlled by your overlord, you will need to gain independence or change status to a subject that's permitted economic autonomy to gain control of your own market. Also, great news. Let's skip that. Will it be possible to stockpile military goods? Would be annoying to lose a war because of market mechanics. Yeah, I think losing a war to market mechanics is actually the goal here. Having everything, war most definitely included, being inextricably tied to market mechanics is a major design pillar for us. No, you cannot stockpile military goods, which means you better hope you have a good gold reserve and either a solid domestic arms industry or reliable trading partners to ensure you don't experience overpricing or a shortage of the military goods that you need to run your army at peak efficiency right as you're marching on the enemy capital. No, yeah, that's what I basically explained earlier. It will go up in price, which is a simulated and abstracted stockpile, and you can run it for a certain time. Maybe you just conquer, where they produce their arms. Maybe you just got a trading partner. Obviously, hey, if you're independent of a different nation in this time period, you're dependent on them. You might not be able to wage a war except, for like the first 12 months, and then you run out. Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. The stockpile, the way it worked in the old game, yeah. Regarding currencies and money supply, like in previous Victorias, the pound symbol is not to be taken as an assertion that all trade happens in British pounds, but as a universal money symbol. I'd love to make a game with multiple currencies and a currency market, but oh my god, the implications. The money supply works on much the same principle. The pound is an arbitrary unit of value, not a literal banknote. When the money is stored in the treasury, it's a gold reserve. When you're running a deficit, it's the debt principle. When a pop has some money left over, it's converted into wealth, so savings, investments, etc. When a pop lacks money, their wealth is drained. The money supply, or value store as it were, is the sum total of treasuries, building cash reserves, and pop wealth, if you want to think of it that way. So I actually do want to bring that up. Much like in Victoria 2, but Victoria 3 actually willingly says that the pound is really just the symbol for money. You're not actually using the pound. It's an abstraction. EU4's money is not actually money. It's an abstraction of monetary availabilities. TK3's money is not actually, it's an abstraction, and Victoria 3 does that the same way. I know a friend of mine, lovely guy, but he is frustrated with Victoria 3 because he would have loved to see a currency simulation. And I don't think I will ever agree with him on that. Like, I think we will always disagree, and that's fine. But he really wants Victoria 3 to be this ambitious, like, hey, let's just try it sort of thing. And I'm like, nah. I can't imagine a currency simulation. But I do want to say, I do think his point of view, and if you hold that point of view, is valid. They confirm it's not in there, but hey, if that puts you off, then keep that in mind. I assume there's some kind of stockpile, right? Like if you declare war, your armies don't instantly go from 100% effectiveness to 0 if your supply of arms was created by the enemy in the war, but rather drop based on some rate, right? In the same way, I'd assume pops don't literally starve to death overnight. In this case, not managed by the player and very limited but existing, perhaps modified by tech, there is some inertia in the system. Yes, for pops, the inertia is their wealth, which represents their savings. For shortages, including shortages in the military, there's a duration of time during which the penalties pile up. like I explained before. Some military goods are also needed to sustain your armies and navies even in peacetime. Could you give us an example of a country which trading city is not the capital city? The USA, where the capital is Washington D.C., but in the market capital is New York. I'd be interested in finding out how that is even determined, frankly. I really hope you'll reconsider this decision, even if it would require a lot of extra work. Being unable to stockpile military goods in anticipation of war certainly takes away from the realism, especially in MP. Well, nothing is impossible. Military stockpiles would insert a bit of inertia into the military system, which means that the economic aspect of warfare becomes relatively less important. Since your gold reserve already effectively acts as a stockpile, having military equipment stockpiles would mean two buffers would have to be depleted before the country runs into any kind of trouble. So, from a design perspective, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense given how the rest of the economy and military system works. Hopefully the reason will become clearer as we continue releasing more information. Reading this, I have a fear that markets might be too rigid. Why isn't it possible for a country to be split between two markets? Also, Lacek already answered in the design of no stockpile, but to some degree this isn't that realistic. Warehouses exist, and logistics as well. What happens if your arms-producing region is invaded for a month? Do your army collapse? They don't, but yeah. In earlier versions of the internal build, we actually had countries split into multiple markets, trying out a variety of design solutions for this, but none of them resulted in satisfying gameplay, as keeping track of all your markets and managing goods flow between them felt more like a chore than anything else, and made it very difficult to understand the overall economic situation in your country. Moving to a single national market basically just made for a better game, as it allows the player to focus their efforts and have a far better understanding of the consequences of the actions they're taking in the market. That said, we haven't completely ruled out having special cases like separate colonial markets. Oh, that would be so good. If we can get that working the way, oh, separate colonial markets, oh my god, I would be so happy about that, seriously. Oh, that would be nice. Right now, I mean, you still need to connect the market via ports and via shipping routes, etc., but like actually having a separate market, I would be a big fan. Is it correct to interpret this as saying that it's possible to buy more of a good than what is being produced just as a higher price? Yes, to a point. It's important to understand that this is intertwined with the decision to not model goods stockpiling. If more goods are bought than sold at a comparatively high price on week 42, some of those goods changing hands might have been produced on week 41 or 27 or 6. In the real world, farms only have a few harvests per year and rely on granaries to ration the excess, doling their supply out over time in order to maximize their profits. The same also goes for other industries to different extents, depending on factors like shelf life, quality, technological obsolescence, etc. In Victoria 3, this stockpiling behavior is abstracted such that for as long as demand and supply remain balanced within some kind of reason, we assume that goods are available but expensive, until they're not, see shortages. And that all goods produced sell for a price, albeit perhaps a low price, even if there is not an end consumer at that particular week. The end result is arguably more realistic, since goods actually being completely unavailable to buy at any price is and was a rare and very disruptive thing. Yeah, I mean, I talked about this, I talked about my point of view on this earlier in the comment section, so refer to that if you got any questions, if you disagree with me or with what was said here. Let's skip these. Let's move on to this. Yeah, I selected what is interesting. To clarify, situations where machine tools TM, goods produce at let's say 10 units, demand is 20, assuming it is below shortage threshold, the world can operate as if 20 units are actually produced, for as long as buyers can afford high prices. I'm especially interested in the case of state, since state can have a very deep pockets, but are 10 or 20 units actually available, and if 20, who pockets the difference for those 10 units that are not produced but were bought from somewhere? In Victoria 2, there was a curious dynamic where you had to create machine tool factories, or your chance of rapid industrialization was zero. Market simply would have supplied to actually build us. What? In Victoria 3, that wouldn't be the issue. As long as I'm willing to shell out extra cash, I can industrialize Russia in 1936, and for a few years, the world will just create machine tools out of thin air for me, right? No. So, it's basically the assumed stockpile, right? What they said here. They will produce goods in X weeks, but it's just flattened out, and that flattened out is represented by the stockpile. If you have zero access to tools, the shortage mechanic will ensure you cannot industrialize. If you have some access to tools, but your demand for it is somewhat higher than that, you will be paying a lot more to industrialize than your more capable competitors. The premium you're paying for tools will go to your tool-producing industries and the pops who own them. If your tool supply comes from imports, it means greater profits for tool producers in the exporting countries. I cannot wait to export tools all the way into like Japan, China, and whatnot, and make mad money. I'm afraid I don't quite understand why such things couldn't be modeled in the old system. Could you give some examples? One fundamental example is that when supply is insufficient, you have to distribute it between prospective purchases by some rational mechanism. So when you have a steel mill and 100 pops who all want to buy coal, who gets to purchase what fraction of the available supply? Right, priority sequence have an overall trade manager, but this is already a computationally difficult problem. Now insert local price conditions based on infrastructure and market access. How much of the market's allotment of coal compared to oil should a farmer in Michigan get to buy when Michigan only has 75% market access, but coal is produced locally? With an open economy where stockpiles are abstracted into the price conditions, we can have all purchases resolve on their own thread and tally up into a total combined price. If the price is too high for some of those purchases to sustain it in the long run, their economic conditions will deteriorate and demand will decrease because they will go bankrupt. This means we can approach an equilibrium over time by each economic agent doing their thing, rather than trying to compute an optimal distribution between all agents, giving a multitude of variables that all influence each other. So, just to sum that up, if you have a shortage to a certain degree, so like not a shortage, but things are higher price, how is it determined who gets what? The answer is everybody gets the same amount, basically what they can afford, what they can purchase with this gets full, but they pay more, and at some point people will drop out, which will lead us back into the equilibrium where the price goes down and the shortage is resolved. So yeah, makes sense. I honestly think this is a good system. I'll just say it outright. If this system works as they say it does, I think this is a good system. But it's time for me to retreat into bed. I'll see you later, probably tomorrow. Have a good one. Let me know in the comments what you think about it, and cheers.